easy, why thumping on it?
Will start ramping up vaccine mandates. But even before Pfizer's FDA approval, vaccine mandates were already rolling out across the country, sparking this question. Who then is liable for injuries that might arise from COVID-19 shots? Trinity Chavez has that story.
Just go ahead and hold that there just to make sure it doesn't fall down.
Back in December 2020, the U.S. began vaccinating Americans as the pandemic crippled the country and much of the world. And while federal health officials have reiterated that mass vaccinations are the way out of the pandemic, recent data shows more than 45% of unvaccinated people don't want it, driven largely by widespread mistrust, especially if something goes wrong with the vaccine and no one is held responsible. That's because the federal government has granted companies like Pfizer and Moderna immunity from liability if something unintentionally goes wrong with their vaccines under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. It protects companies making or distributing critical medical supplies, such as vaccines and treatments, unless there's willful misconduct by the company. The protection lasts until 2024. That means for the next 4 years, these companies cannot be sued for money damages in court over injuries related to the administration or use of products to treat or protect against COVID-19. Rogue Dunn, a Dallas labor and employment attorney, said in an interview, it is very rare for a blanket immunity law to be passed. Pharmaceutical companies typically aren't offered much liability protection under the law. And while you also can't sue the Food and Drug Administration for authorizing a vaccine for emergency use, there are government programs that deal with these kinds of lawsuits. First, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, or NVICP, and second, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, or CICP, which was established by the PrEP Act. The first one was set up in the 80s, which deals with people who want to sue because of adverse side effects from the shots, like the flu or HPV shots. Federal courts are involved in those type of lawsuits, while the second covers COVID-19 vaccines and other special shots related to a health emergency.
We are a federal government program available to help the public in the event that they incur out-of-pocket medical expenses or lost wages as the result of an injury from a covered countermeasure.
But experts say there are three major problems with using CICP as your main tool. It's very hard to show proof that the vaccine or another measure caused harm with compelling scientific and medical evidence, which isn't always available early on. There is also a strict one-year statute, which means all claims have to be filed within 12 months of receiving the vaccine. And if you have compensation from any other source, including health insurance, the program won't compensate you.
Have your vaccinations ready. I appreciate that.
This is where mandates intersect with the private sector and compensation. While you can't hold your employer accountable if they require that you get the COVID-19 vaccine, but if you got the COVID-19 vaccine and you were injured, you can apply for workers' compensation and get compensation through an easier system than CICP. Now, experts say vaccine injuries should instead be routed to another program called the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which handles claims for 16 routine vaccines. But the COVID-19 vaccine is not one of them. Reporting in New York, Trinity Chavez, RT.
And joining us to discuss that, attorney at Levin, Papantonio and Rafferty, Michael Bixby is here. Mike, thanks for joining us today. So this week, we saw that the FDA granted full approval for the Pfizer COVID vaccine. Prior to that, we know they operated under emergency use authorization. So those who received their vaccine basically relinquished the rights to sue should any harm arise after they received the Pfizer vax. Now that they are fully FDA approved, like a polio vaccine or the measles vaccine, will Pfizer still be shielded from product liability through the normal court filings?
The answer is yes, they will. And that's actually true. Normal court filings, what you think of, hey, if you're harmed, you need to go to state court or federal court, get your case in front of a jury, be able to find all the evidence, be able to search for the truth, prove your case if somebody's wronged you. That's not an option, and that's not unique to the COVID-19 vaccines. That's pretty much all vaccines. That's not available to them. And as the report talked about, there's a couple of other options. There's vaccine court, but that's not the same as regular court. That's not the same as going and getting in front of a jury in the same way. But as you pointed out, vaccine court's not available, and even the FDA approval's not going to change that. So the COVID-19 vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, you won't be able to submit a claim via the usual vaccine court method. The only thing available to you is that CICP, the Countermeasure Injury Compensation Program. And that program does almost nothing. Professor Renee Gentry from George Washington University, she said about the vaccine CICP program that you'd have to go through for the COVID-19 vaccine, that you have the right to file a claim and you have the right to lose. There's no due process, there's no judge, there's no judicial appeal, and there's absolutely no transparency. It's been called repeatedly a black hole of a process that you go through with a nameless administrator, and the proof's in the pudding with it. In the last 10 years, less than 3 claims a year have been compensated through that program. So while vaccine court itself, it doesn't have the same procedural protections that you get in a state or federal court. You don't get to present the same evidence. You don't get to present to a jury of your peers like you would in a normal civil case. It's still much, much better than, say, the CICP program, which does virtually nothing. And the vaccine court, like I said, is still flawed. The process can take 10 years. There's strict limitations on damages. It's limited to only certain vaccines, but it would be a heck of a lot better than the CIPC program.
Now, let me ask you this, Michael. The NVICP, aka vaccine court, works similar to a traditional civil court. However, there are only a limited number of types of vaccine cases they will hear. Why have they not added the various COVID vaccines to this list?
That's a great question. And frankly, the answer is probably that more people aren't asking that question, because most people aren't even aware that this weird legal system, this special legal system, even exists at all. There has been some legislation introduced. There's a Vaccine Court Modernization Act that has been introduced. It has not passed, and I don't think has garnered a lot of attention or a lot of support, that would actually add COVID vaccines to the vaccine court list. And that would be in a more fair system, at least compared to the CICP, although a very flawed and imperfect system. I would argue that that would actually be a much better thing, frankly, for the vaccine in general. This isn't necessarily an anti-vaccine thing. Personally, I'm vaccinated. I have the Pfizer vaccine. I think this would be a good thing for vaccine hesitancy for a lot of people who don't want to get it. And this is a concern, that a lot of people don't want to get it, and then they're being told, or if they understand, hey, if something bad does happen, if there is an adverse side effect, there's basically nothing for you to do. So this is a good thing and doesn't need to be seen as anti-vaccine. This is something it's fair. We're asking people to do it. There needs to be some sort of accountability and system. The vaccine court, again, while imperfect, and I would argue there's a lot that could be done to make that system more fair, because there's a lot of unfairness built into that system, but it would be better, I think, to add in COVID vaccines to the vaccine court compared to where they are right now.
I agree with all of that sentiment. Real quickly, Michael, according to the rules of the NVICP and the CDC, healthcare providers are legally obligated to give everyone a VIS, a vaccine info statement, a document describing what the vaccine is for, who should get it, who shouldn't get it, in simple terms. That is required under the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. There is evidence to suggest that this has not been done with the 3 COVID vaccines available in America. Whether or not anyone's been injured by these vaccines, is that enough grounds for an upcoming wave of class action lawsuits?
I don't think so. The restrictions that are in place right now legally are that restrictive. They're that punitive in nature. They bar, I think, almost any type of action like that. Even if there was some form that was required to be given, my expectation would be is that liability, or actually accountability in a court, would be almost impossible.
Wow. And people wonder why it feels like the laws are written for big pharma, big companies, and not the average Joe. Michael Bixby, attorney at Levin Papantonio Rafferty, thank you so much.
It's easy, why? Something on it.